Daniel was driving slowly along the quiet road that led out of the town, the evening sun turning the sky into soft shades of orange and pink. He had just left his mother's house, where he spent most of the afternoon fixing a broken shelf and helping her move some old boxes. His mother had hugged him tight before he left, reminding him to drive safe, because the road home could get dark quickly. Daniel always smiled at her concern. No matter how old he became, she treated him like he was still her little boy. He rolled down the window a little to let in the cool breeze. The scent of pine trees and fresh dirt drifted inside his car. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of simple calm he appreciated after a long day. He wasn't in a rush. His favorite radio station played soft music, the kind that made the drive feel even lighter. Daniel kept his hands steady on the wheel and hummed along without thinking about much. It had been a normal day, and he expected a normal evening. But sometimes life changes direction without warning, and Daniel was moments away from experiencing one of those turns. As he passed the small grocery store near the edge of town, he noticed a police cruiser parked on the side. The lights were off, and the car looked like it was just sitting there, maybe watching traffic or waiting for speeders. Daniel didn't think anything of it at first. He checked his speed out of habit. He was going only a little under the limit, completely normal. But something about the cruiser's sudden movement caught his eye. The police car pulled out slowly, almost right after Daniel passed. It stayed far behind him at first, following but not too close. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He didn't want to assume anything. Cars follow other cars all the time. Maybe the officer had somewhere to go. Maybe he was responding to a call. But Daniel felt the presence behind him grow heavier the longer it stayed. A few minutes later, the cruiser sped up, got closer, then pulled into his lane. Daniel's heart thumped a little faster. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because anyone in his position would feel uneasy. The police lights flashed on. Red and blue reflections danced across the road and the side of Daniel's car. He slowly breathed out and guided his car to the shoulder. He knew the drill. Pull over safely. Keep your hands where they can be seen. Stay calm. Even though he was naturally a calm person, he still felt a small wave of tension inside. Being stopped by a police officer was rarely a comfortable experience, especially when you had no idea why. He shifted into park and kept both hands on the steering wheel. The cruiser pulled up behind him, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the faint clicking of the emergency lights. In the side mirror, Daniel watched the officer open the door and step out. The man walked toward his car with a firm, almost stiff posture. He looked irritated before even reaching the window, as if he already believed Daniel was doing something wrong. The officer tapped on the glass. Daniel lowered the window slowly. "Evening, officer," Daniel said politely. His voice was steady, friendly, respectful. The officer didn't answer right away. His eyes moved around the inside of the car, scanning the seats, the dashboard, the floor. Then he looked directly at Daniel. "License and registration." Daniel nodded. "Sure. They're in my glove compartment." "I'm just going to reach for them, all right?" The officer sighed impatiently. "Just get 'em." Daniel kept his movements slow and clear. He opened the glove box, took out the registration papers, then pulled his wallet from the center console. He handed everything over. The officer barely glanced at the documents before asking, "What are you doing around here?" "This isn't your part of town." Daniel felt a small sting at the question, but he kept his tone gentle. "I was visiting my mother. She lives just a few streets back." "Uh-huh." The officer didn't sound convinced. He leaned a little closer. "You in a hurry to get somewhere?" "No, sir. Just heading home." The officer scratched his chin slowly, like he was trying to catch Daniel in some kind of lie. "You look nervous." Daniel shook his head calmly. "Just sitting here waiting for you, that's all." The officer stared at him for a long moment. Something in the man's expression suggested he had already made up his mind about Daniel before the stop even began. There was a coldness in the officer's eyes, the kind that didn't come from professionalism, but from personal judgment. "Step out of the car," the officer finally said. Daniel blinked. "Is something wrong, officer?" "I said step out of the car." Daniel didn't argue. Arguing never helped in situations like this. He slowly opened his door and stepped out. The evening breeze felt cooler now, almost sharp. The officer stood in front of him, arms crossed, chin raised slightly like he was trying to establish dominance. "Where exactly did you say you were coming from again?" the officer asked. "My mother's house," Daniel repeated calmly. "I was helping her with a few things today. You expect me to just believe that?" Daniel didn't respond right away. He didn't want to say anything that could be taken the wrong way. "I don't mind answering any questions you have," he said carefully. "But I'm not sure why I was pulled over." The officer smirked. "Suspicious driving?" Daniel knew he hadn't been driving suspiciously at all. His speed was steady, his car was in good condition, and the road was nearly empty. But he understood that challenging the officer's claim would only make things worse. He stayed quiet. The officer circled around the car, looking at every detail, as if searching for something. Daniel stood still, watching from the corner of his eye. The officer checked the trunk area, even though it was closed, then tried to peer through the back seats. A few cars passed by slowly, some drivers glancing over but continuing their evening. After a few minutes, the officer came back. "You sure you're not hiding anything?" "No, sir." "You got anything illegal in the car?" "No, sir," Daniel repeated calmly. The officer looked disappointed, like he wanted a different answer. "You always this calm?" Daniel gave a small, polite smile. "I try to be." The officer didn't like that response. His jaw tightened. He stepped closer again, almost too close, as if trying to intimidate him. "You know, people who act calm usually have something to hide." Daniel didn't lose his composure. "I don't have anything to hide." "Uh-huh." The officer paced a little, then made a quick decision. "I'm going to take you in for some questions." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Take me in?" "For what?" "You'll find out," the officer said vaguely. "Turn around." Daniel had a brief moment where he thought about asking for a supervisor, but he knew that demanding too much could make things worse. He didn't want the situation to escalate. He didn't want anyone raising their voice or making accusations. He had experienced bias before, but he always handled it with patience. It was something he learned from his mother, who always said, "Calm minds make honest truths easier to see." He slowly turned around. The officer guided him toward the police cruiser, his tone sharp and judgmental the whole way. Daniel didn't resist, didn't lift his voice, didn't show anger. He just walked. The officer opened the back door of the cruiser and told him to sit. The seat was uncomfortable, firm plastic instead of soft padding. Daniel sat quietly, hands resting on his lap. Through the window, he watched the officer return to his car and call something over the radio. Daniel couldn't hear the words clearly, but he could see the officer's irritated expression. Like he truly believed Daniel was some kind of criminal trying to act innocent. Daniel leaned, his head back against the seat, and took a slow breath. He didn't know what the officer thought he was doing, but Daniel understood one thing clearly. The man had already judged him long before asking his first question. The stop wasn't about traffic. It wasn't about safety. It was about assumptions. As the cruiser began moving toward the station, Daniel looked out at the passing trees and quiet houses. He didn't know how long this misunderstanding would last, but he knew he could handle it. Patience and calm had carried him through bigger challenges than this. The officer didn't know anything about who he truly was. Not his job. Not his experience. Not the people he worked with. Not the things he'd seen. And for now, Daniel chose to keep it that way. He sat there, silent but steady, letting the ride continue. The officer might have power in that moment. Daniel held a quiet strength the man could not see, yet a strength that would soon change everything. The renew. Click to edit to the police station was quiet, except for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the officer's radio. Daniel kept his eyes on the passing scenery, though the calm he tried to maintain felt fragile. Every turn of the road reminded him that he was at the mercy of someone else's judgment. He didn't speak, not because he wanted to be rude, but because he understood that words might inflame a situation that could already be tense. Sometimes silence carried more weight than speech. When they arrived at the station, Daniel was guided to a small waiting area. The lights were bright and harsh, bouncing off the pale walls. Chairs lined the walls, and a few other people sat quietly, either reading or staring blankly ahead. Daniel noticed a clock ticking methodically on the wall. The seconds passed slowly, but in each second, he felt the weight of being watched, assessed, and misunderstood. Officer Harris motioned for him to follow. "Sit here. Don't move." The tone wasn't threatening, but it was sharp, commanding. Daniel complied immediately. He had learned that cooperation, even under unfair circumstances, often prevented things from escalating. He kept his posture straight, hands visible, and eyes forward, not out of fear, but out of respect for the protocol he knew well. While Daniel waited, Harris left the room. Daniel took the opportunity to breathe more deeply, letting his mind settle into small calculations about how best to navigate the situation. He thought about his mother, who would be worried if she knew what was happening. He thought about work, where colleagues trusted him to remain composed even under pressure. This was only a temporary moment, he reminded himself. He had faced more difficult challenges and had never lost his sense of clarity. Patience and strategy had always carried him through. Harris returned, joined by another officer Daniel didn't recognize. The younger man seemed uneasy, shifting slightly from foot to foot, glancing at Harris and then at Daniel. He gave a subtle nod to Daniel, but quickly looked away. Daniel noticed the small gesture, the human hint of acknowledgement that not everyone in the room agreed with the situation. It gave him a quiet reassurance that fairness might still be possible. "Even in a flawed system, your license says you live here. But I know you were elsewhere," Harris said, leaning back in his chair with arms crossed. "You've got nothing to say about that?" Daniel kept his voice calm. "I was visiting my mother. That's all." "Unhung," Harris replied, the tone heavy with disbelief. He tapped the table with his fingers, a rhythmic sound that made Daniel's awareness sharpen. He knew Harris expected an emotional reaction, maybe even a defensive one. Daniel refused to provide it. Anger, frustration, or defensiveness would give Harris his power he didn't deserve. Daniel chose composure. The officer leaned closer. "You know, most people in your situation would be nervous. They'd sweat, they'd fumble, they'd look guilty," Daniel met his gaze steadily. "Some people can stay calm even when they're wrongly accused," Harris scowled. "And you expect me to believe that?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch a little, careful to maintain the balance between politeness and strength. Then he said simply, "I've been in situations where patience mattered more than anything else. Calm can sometimes speak louder than words." The officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't like that Daniel was unshaken. He shifted his weight, then nodded to the younger officer. "Check his car and see if anything looks suspicious." Daniel's chest tightened slightly, but he didn't show it. The younger officer hesitated, then left the room. Daniel could hear faint footsteps echoing through the hall as the search began. He remained seated, hands visible, breathing slowly. He reminded himself that he had nothing to hide, and that truth had a quiet power of its own. After a long few minutes, the younger officer returned. He looked uncertain as he handed Harris a clipboard. Harris scanned it quickly, his frown deepening. "Nothing?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Nothing at all?" Daniel nodded calmly. "Nothing illegal? Nothing suspicious?" "Like I said, I was just visiting my mother." Harris slammed the clipboard lightly on the table, the sound sharp and angry. "Most people in your position would sweat. You make me wonder why you're so calm." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I believe being calm helps resolve things faster. It's easier to show the truth when you're composed." The officer paused, as if weighing his words, then muttered something under his breath and stood up. "You're lucky this time," he said vaguely. Daniel didn't respond. Luck had nothing to do with it. He knew that truth and patience were stronger than assumptions and prejudice. Harris left the room again. It's time for what seemed like a longer period. Daniel had a moment to glance around. The waiting area had a few people, each quietly absorbed in their own reality. Some glanced at him curiously. Others pretended not to notice. It was strange, he thought, how people could be so focused on their own lives while someone else's life was being judged unfairly right beside them. It was a lesson in perspective, in humility, and in the invisible threads that connected human experiences. Eventually, Harris returned alone. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that Daniel noticed. "Sit tight," Harris said. "I need to make some calls." Daniel stayed seated, hands resting on his lap. He thought about how different each person's day could be. How one moment could drastically change the way someone was seen. He reminded himself not to let frustration creep in. Anger or fear could only make things worse. His calmness was his shield, and it was also his voice. It spoke without shouting. It demanded respect without aggression. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Daniel focused on small things, the flickering fluorescent lights above, the hum of the ventilation system, the quiet ticking of the clock. Each detail grounded him in reality. He had been trained in observation and patience for moments just like this. Life, he thought, often put people in situations where their true character could be tested. And this, unfair as it was one of those tests. The younger officer returned once more, glancing nervously at Harris. Daniel noticed the silent exchange of tension. Something about the younger man's posture suggested that not everyone agreed with how this stop was being handled. Daniel gave a small, polite nod to the officer. The man's eyes widened slightly, almost as if acknowledging that Daniel's composure was noticed. It was a subtle human connection in an otherwise difficult situation. Finally, Harris returned, holding a small stack of papers. He sat down heavily, his chair creaking under the weight. He glanced at Daniel. "You've got an attitude," he said flatly. Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm just trying to be respectful." Harris' eyes darted around the room as if searching for another way to assert authority. "You know, some people in your position would have made a mistake by now." Daniel leaned forward slightly, keeping his tone gentle but firm. "Mistakes happen, yes. But staying calm often prevents them. It can also reveal the truth." The officer seemed frustrated, but Daniel didn't react. He had learned that control over his own mind was far more powerful than control over external circumstances. His patience was quiet but steady, like the flow of a river that refused to be disturbed by stones in its path. He wasn't trying to prove anything in that room. He was simply being himself, and that he knew mattered more than anyone else's assumptions. Time stretched on. The room remained quiet. Each passing second reminded Daniel that the real power in this situation was not held by anger, authority, or assumptions. It was held by composure, clarity, and the quiet insistence on truth. And Daniel had those in abundance. By the time Harris finally left the room for what felt like the last time, Daniel remained seated, calm, collected, and unwavering. He had navigated the tension with patience, understanding that every word, every gesture, and every moment of stillness carried meaning. The officer might have had the badge, but Daniel had the quiet strength of a man who knew himself. That strength would guide him through what came next. Though neither he nor anyone else in the room could predict just how much change it would bring, Daniel sat quietly in the small, brightly lit room, waiting for what felt like the next phase of the evening. The tension in the air was thick, and each second seemed heavier than the last. He had remained calm throughout the stop and the brief questioning, but he knew that staying composed now was even more important. Any sudden movement, any sharp word, could be misunderstood. He kept his hands folded neatly on his lap and focused on his breathing, letting the calm inside him steady his thoughts. The younger officer, the one who had seemed hesitant earlier, returned once more. He avoided direct eye contact with Harris, the senior officer, and glanced briefly at Daniel. Daniel caught the look, a small flicker of recognition, maybe even concern. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Daniel understood it. Not everyone in the room agreed with what was happening. There was a small thread of fairness here, though it was fragile. "Mr. Daniels." Harris finally spoke, his voice firm and measured. "I'm going to need you to cooperate fully while we clarify some things. You understand that, right?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I will cooperate." Harris leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Good. That's good to hear. But don't mistake this for leniency. People who look calm often have hidden agendas. I want you to be completely honest with me." Daniel kept his expression neutral. "I have been honest. I'm happy to answer any questions you have." The officer's tone was sharp, but there was an edge of doubt creeping into it. He called for the younger officer to come closer and whispered something that Daniel couldn't hear. The younger officer nodded, hesitated, and then glanced at Daniel again. This time, Daniel gave a small, polite smile. It was not a smile of mockery or sarcasm. It was simple acknowledgement, a human gesture that carried quiet reassurance. The young officer looked away quickly, as if afraid he had been noticed. Minutes passed in silence. Daniel focused on small details around him to keep his mind steady. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the subtle creak of the chairs as Harris shifted his weight, the muffled sounds of footsteps from other parts of the station, all of it became a rhythm that helped him maintain composure. He had learned long ago that in moments of tension, observation was a powerful tool. It grounded him, allowed him to understand the space he occupied, and gave him a measure of control over his own reactions. Finally, Harris spoke again. "I'm going to need to know why you were in the neighborhood and why your story doesn't match what I was told." His voice was cold, but controlled, precise. Daniel listened carefully, measuring each word before answering. "I was visiting my mother," he said calmly. "I helped her with some things around the house. That is all." Harris frowned, tapping the table with his fingers. "That's not enough. You need to provide more detail." Daniel hesitated just slightly, choosing his words with care. "I spent the afternoon helping her move boxes, fixing a broken shelf, and making sure everything was in order. I left after I made sure she was comfortable and safe." His voice was steady, confident, but not defensive. "That is the full truth." The officer leaned back, scowling. He seemed frustrated that Daniel's calmness wasn't faltering under pressure. "You know, most people in your situation would be rattled. They'd stumble. They'd be nervous, but you seem to calm?" Daniel gave a small nod. "Calmness doesn't mean guilt. Calmness means control. It helps people see truth more clearly." Harris stared at him for a moment, perhaps expecting another answer. Daniel remained silent, allowing the pause to stretch. Silence, he knew, often spoke louder than words. It forced the other person to reflect, even if briefly, on their own behavior and assumptions. The younger officer returned to the room again, carrying a folder. He glanced at Harris, then at Daniel, and placed the folder on the table. Daniel's eyes followed every movement. The officer seemed unsure, hesitant, as if he was aware of the tension and did not want to make it worse. Daniel gave him a calm nod, a silent gesture of acknowledgement and reassurance. The young officer's posture relaxed slightly, though he quickly looked away. As if afraid to let it show, Harris picked up the folder and flipped through it quickly. He muttered under his breath, clearly irritated. Daniel noticed how the officer's frustration seemed more about Daniel's calmness and clarity than any real wrongdoing. Harris was expecting resistance, panic, or confusion. Instead, he found steady, measured answers and a presence that refused to be shaken. "Do you have anything in your car that might explain this discrepancy?" Harris asked, leaning forward again. His eyes were sharp, searching for any sign of deceit. "No, sir," Daniel replied firmly. "Everything in my car is personal and legal. You can check if you wish, but there is nothing to hide." Harris scowled, clearly not satisfied with the answer, but unable to find a fault. He set the folder down and sighed. "You're different from most people. Too different. That makes me suspicious." Daniel tilted his head slightly. Being different doesn't mean dishonesty. It only means we may see things differently. Calmness and truth often appear unusual when someone expects panic or deception. The officer looked at him, perhaps realizing that he had underestimated Daniel's ability to remain composed. He stood, pacing for a moment. Daniel observed quietly, noting the officer's movements, his expressions, and his tone. Every gesture seemed calculated, every pause deliberate. Daniel remained centered, focused on the facts, on the truth, and on the principle of patience. Then, unexpectedly, the younger officer spoke. "Sir, there's something in his wallet." His voice was soft, cautious, almost hesitant. Daniel's head lifted slightly. He hadn't reacted. Harris turned sharply to the younger officer. "What do you mean?" "There's a badge. Looks official. I I'm not sure what it is exactly, the young officer said, glancing nervously at Daniel. Harris's expression hardened. Badge? What badge? His eyes locked on Daniel, who simply met his gaze without flinching. Daniel's lips curved into a small, polite smile. You'll see soon enough, he said quietly. There was no challenge in his voice, no threat. Just calm, quiet certainty. Harris' scowl deepened. He was clearly irritated, frustrated by the unexpected development. He barked at the younger officer to hand him the wallet. The officer did so, hesitating for just a moment before placing it on the table. Harris flipped it open and paused as he saw the official insignia and identification. He studied it quickly, muttering under his breath. Daniel remained seated, composed, letting the discovery unfold. He didn't rush, didn't gloat, didn't make the officer uncomfortable through words. His presence alone spoke. The calm and quiet strength that had carried him through the stop now filled the room. Creating a subtle shift in energy, the younger officer looked at Daniel again, as if silently acknowledging the truth he had sensed from the beginning. The small gestures, unnoticed by Harris, mattered. Daniel's patience and composure were now beginning to reshape the dynamics in the room. Even before anyone fully realized it, Harris muttered something and stepped back, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Daniel's calm, steady presence contrasted sharply with the officer's frustration, demonstrating that composure and clarity could hold more power than authority alone. As the moments stretched, Daniel understood that the situation was moving toward a turning point. The officer might still hold the badge and the power, but Daniel had something else: patience, truth, and the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own worth. And sometimes, Daniel reflected silently, that combination could change everything. The room was silent for a moment as Harris held the identification in his hands. Daniel remained seated, hands resting calmly on his lap, his expression composed. The younger officer shifted uneasily, glancing between Harris and Daniel. There was a quiet tension in the air, a mix of surprise, disbelief, and something else that neither of them could name. Daniel simply waited, knowing that time and patience were allies in situations like this. Harris finally broke the silence. This says you're with the FBI. His voice was a mixture of disbelief and frustration, tinged with an edge of hesitation. Daniel nodded slowly, his calm unwavering. Yes, sir. That is correct. The officer's eyes scanned the identification again, almost as if looking for a mistake. He flipped it over, examining the details carefully. Daniel sat quietly, observing the shift in Harris's posture. The way the officer seemed uncertain now, unsure how to act or what to say. For the first time since the evening began, Harris's confident, judgmental demeanor faltered. He was no longer in complete control, and Daniel's presence, steady and composed, highlighted that fact. You've never mentioned this before, Harris said finally. His voice was sharp, but had lost some of its authority. Why not? Daniel replied gently, without defensiveness. Because there was no reason to mention it during a routine drive. I am trained to cooperate fully when asked, and I have done so. My identity is not relevant unless necessary, he spoke calmly, clearly. With an assurance that made it difficult for the officer to dismiss him, Harris ran a hand through his hair, pacing briefly. You expect me to believe everything now? Just like that? You're FBI and I treated you like someone suspicious. His voice had a mixture of tension and embarrassment. Daniel noticed the subtle regret beneath the frustration. People often realize the truth of a situation too late, and Harris was beginning to recognize that. I understand why you may have made assumptions, Daniel said softly. But assumptions do not define a person. Acts do. And facts are what we must rely on. His tone was calm, measured, and non-confrontational. It carried the quiet authority of someone used to high-stakes situations where patience and clarity mattered more than anger or emotion. The younger officer spoke again, this time more confidently. Sir, I think he's being truthful. I noticed how calm he was from the beginning. It wasn't fear or guilt, it was control. He's different from what we expected. He glanced at Daniel, then quickly looked away, his words careful. Daniel gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the officer without drawing attention to himself. Small gestures mattered, even when unspoken. Harris exhaled sharply, his eyes flicking to the door, then back to Daniel. So all of this stop, the questioning was unnecessary? His voice had lost some of its previous edge, replaced by uncertainty and hesitation. Daniel's calm demeanor remained unchanged, his patience like a steady anchor in a storm of confusion. Unnecessary if judged only by assumptions, Daniel replied. Necessary if it helps to understand why we act as we do, and how bias can affect judgment. Awareness is always necessary, even if the conclusions drawn are mistaken. Harris's scowl softened slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. He placed the identification back on the table, his fingers lingering over it for a moment before withdrawing. There was a shift in the room, subtle but real. The tension was still there, but it had changed shape. No longer purely confrontation, it had become reflection and acknowledgement, silent but palpable, of the evening's lesson. The younger officer leaned against the wall, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Sir, I think we should let him go. He's proven he's cooperative, and the ID confirms who he is." I don't think there's anything more to do." His voice carried caution, respect, and perhaps a hint of relief. Daniel noted the tone, understanding the unspoken human recognition in it. People often feel relief when truth is revealed. The tension of uncertainty begins to dissipate. Harris paused, staring at Daniel, then slowly nodded. Yes, you can leave. I apologize for the inconvenience." His tone was stiff but sincere. Daniel remained seated a moment longer, letting the gravity of the words sink in. The apology, simple as it was, reflected a subtle acknowledgement of his authority and the respect he deserved. Words matter, Daniel thought. Even when delayed, acknowledgement is important. Daniel stood carefully, keeping his movements smooth and unhurried. He picked up his personal belongings and walked toward the door. Each step was deliberate, measured, a continuation of the composure that had carried him through the evening. Harris stepped aside, allowing him to leave. The gesture, though small, was significant. It represented a transition from confrontation to understanding, from bias to recognition, from assumption to awareness. As Daniel walked past the younger officer, he gave a small nod, quiet and human. The officer returned it with subtle hesitation, then quickly looked away. In that simple exchange, there was a connection, unspoken but powerful. Human recognition often comes in small gestures, and Daniel understood that well. It was a reminder that patience, composure, and truth could resonate quietly yet deeply with those who observe closely. Outside the station, the night air was crisp and clean. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the calm return fully to his senses. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the quiet hum of the town at night was peaceful. He approached his car, glancing briefly at the police station behind him. The evening had been tense, challenging, and illuminating. He understood the lessons it held for both himself and those involved. He got into his car, closed the door gently, and started the engine. The hum of the vehicle was steady, familiar, grounding. As he drove away, Daniel reflected on the night's events. Bias, assumptions, and judgment can cloud perception even for those with authority. Calmness, truth, and patience, however, can reveal clarity and understanding. Human reactions are complex, often flawed, but they can be guided by quiet presence and integrity. The drive home was peaceful. Daniel allowed himself to relax further, feeling the evening's lessons settle into his mind. He thought of his mother, imagining her calm smile and the simple wisdom she often shared. He thought of the younger officer, unsure but observant, whose subtle acknowledgement had reminded him that even in flawed systems, human recognition persists. And he thought of Harris, whose rigid assumptions had been challenged, perhaps leaving a small opening for reflection by the time Daniel reached his neighborhood. The stars were visible in the clear night sky. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated familiar roads and houses. He parked in his driveway, shut off the engine, and took a slow breath, appreciating the quiet of the moment. The evening had been more than a simple stop by a police officer. It had been a test of composure, a reflection on bias, a quiet reminder of the power of patience and truth. Daniel stepped out of the car and walked toward his home. The porch light welcomed him, a small beacon of warmth and safety. He paused briefly, looking up at the stars, thinking of how the night had unfolded. Life, he reflected, often presents challenges that reveal character, patience, and human strength. The evening had been one of those challenges, and he had met it with calm, clarity, and quiet dignity. As he entered his home, he felt the weight of the evening lift. The lessons remained etched in memory, composure in the face of misunderstanding, patience in the presence of bias, and truth's quiet but undeniable power. It was a night that would not be forgotten, for Daniel or for those who had witnessed even a fraction of it. And as he prepared for the calm of sleep, he knew that patience, integrity, and human understanding were the truest strengths one could carry through life. The next morning, Daniel woke early, the sunlight streaming through the curtains of his bedroom. The events of the previous evening lingered in his mind, a mix of tension, relief, and reflection. Even though the stop and questioning were over, he knew the experience had left a mark not just on him, but on those who had encountered him. He could still feel the subtle shifts in energy, the small moments of recognition, and the lessons quietly shared without words. He brewed a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch, inhaling the crisp morning air. The quiet of the neighborhood contrasted sharply with the tension of the night before. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distance, and a few early commuters passed by, their cars humming softly along the roads. Daniel let the morning sun warm his face, grounding himself in simple, steady reality. Calmness, he thought, was more than a response, it was a choice. He reflected on Harris, the officer whose assumptions had driven much of the tension. Daniel did not hold anger for him. In fact, he understood the human tendency to judge quickly, to rely on biases, and to act from fear rather than knowledge. Daniel believed in the power of quiet lessons. Sometimes people learn best not when they are reprimanded, but when they witness composure, patience, and truth in action. Harris had observed these things. He may not have admitted it aloud, but Daniel knew the night had shifted something, even if only slightly in the officer's perspective. The younger officer came to mind as well. His subtle gestures, the small signs of acknowledgement and respect, reminded Daniel that humanity often reveals itself in quiet ways. Not everyone participates in bias. Some notice and learn, even when they are caught between authority and morality. Those moments, though brief, carry weight over time. Daniel had seen that firsthand. After finishing his coffee, Daniel decided to take a short walk around his neighborhood. The streets were calm, and he greeted neighbors who waved back with simple smiles. Life continued, ordinary yet meaningful. The previous evening's events seemed distant now, yet the lessons lingered like faint but persistent echoes. As he walked, he thought about the principle of patience. It had guided him through the stop, the questioning, and the subtle power struggle that had taken place in the station. Patience allowed him to maintain composure, observe details, and act without provocation. It prevented escalation and created space for clarity. In life, Daniel realized patience was more than a virtue. It was a tool, a way to navigate complexity and uncertainty without losing oneself. He returned home and sat at his desk, considering the lessons in human behavior he had witnessed. Fear, bias, and assumptions could distort reality, but awareness, observation, and calm could restore it. People often act based on incomplete understanding, reacting instinctively rather than rationally. By modeling composure and honesty, Daniel had shown, without confrontation, the difference between assumption and fact. This was a reminder that influence does not always come through words or authority. Often comes through presence and integrity. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a colleague from work, someone who had heard about the incident through local news. The colleague's voice carried curiosity, concern, and a subtle note of admiration. "I heard about last night," the voice said. "Are you okay?" Daniel smiled, even though the caller could not see it. "Yes, I'm fine. It was unexpected, but it's over now." Everyone involved has learned something, I think. The colleague hesitated, then said, "You handled it. Calmly, even when things could have gone badly." Daniel nodded, although the gesture was unseen. Calmness is a choice. It doesn't mean the situation is easy, it means you handle it with clarity and control. That's what makes the difference. After the call, Daniel sat quietly, reflecting on the power of integrity. The night had been a test, but it was also a reminder that human strength is often quiet. Authority and assumptions may dominate, but truth, patience, and observation hold lasting power. He understood now that influence is subtle. Actions that demonstrate honesty and composure can leave impressions that words alone cannot. Later that day, Daniel visited his mother again. She had noticed that he seemed calmer, more at peace despite the events of the previous night. She greeted him with her usual warmth, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You handled everything well," she said softly. "I could feel it." Daniel smiled, a quiet, grounded expression. "It wasn't easy, but I did my best. That's all any of us can do." She nodded, as if understanding more than he said. Sometimes, he reflected, family and close connections notice the subtle strength in people, the courage to remain composed, the wisdom to act with patience, and the ability to teach lessons without words. These were the true markers of character. The evening came, quiet and calm. Daniel sat by the window, watching the sun set in gentle hues of orange and pink. The reflection of light on the houses and streets reminded him that each day carries moments of learning, moments of patience, and moments of reflection. Life's challenges may arrive unexpectedly, but they also offer opportunities to demonstrate integrity, composure, and strength. He thought about Harris one last time before night fully fell. The officer had made assumptions, acted hastily, and been confronted with truth in a way that was subtle but undeniable. Perhaps Harris would remember this lesson the next time he faced uncertainty or judgment. Perhaps he would act differently. Change often comes quietly, through observation and reflection, not confrontation. Daniel understood this deeply, having lived it. The younger officer's hesitant acknowledgement lingered in his mind as well. Human recognition, even small and cautious, mattered. It reinforced the idea that patience, composure, and integrity are contagious in subtle ways. People notice behavior, even when unspoken, and it can inspire understanding, empathy, and change. Daniel prepared for bed. The events of the past 2 nights settled into memory. He felt the calm satisfaction of having remained true to himself, of having acted with integrity in the face of misunderstanding and bias. The lessons would stay with him, shaping the way he approached life, work, and relationships as he lay down. He reflected on the larger truth. Life often presents challenges that test patience, honesty, and composure. Those who maintain calm, who act with clarity and integrity, hold power far beyond what authority or assumption can provide. Influence does not always come from shouting or commanding. It comes from being steady, truthful, and patient in the moments that truly matter. The night outside was quiet. Stars glimmered faintly in the sky, distant yet constant. Daniel felt the quiet strength within himself echo in harmony with the calm night. The experience with Harris, the station, and the officers had been a reminder that human connection, observation, and patience are enduring forces. With that understanding, Daniel drifted into sleep, calm, centered, and at peace. The world outside remained imperfect, full of assumptions and misjudgments, but he had proven the enduring power of truth, composure, and patience. And in that quiet victory, he found reassurance, strength, and the quiet certainty that even in the most challenging moments, integrity and calm would always prevail.